Before I begin, a brief note for clarity. The names I'm going to use are assigned names. They're placeholders, meant to help you follow the sequence of events. The real names tied to the documents and testimonies I reviewed have been withheld. Now, I'm going to take you straight into it. Because the first time I read the account, I remember thinking, asterisk, this isn't a story about a man on death row. Asterisk. It's a story about a place and what a place can become when death is scheduled, processed, and carried out like paperwork. Late in the 1980s, inside the state prison complex in Huntsville, Texas, there was an execution set for a man I will call Caleb Monroe. He was in his mid-30s, a truck driver by trade, born and raised in Texas, rough around the edges, the kind of man you'd pass at a gas station and never remember. He had been convicted for a killing outside a bar near Houston, a drunk fight, a knife, a body behind a building. The kind of case people like to label simple because simple makes it easier to sleep at night. The execution was by lethal injection. Now, most people imagine executions as loud, dramatic events. They expect screaming, thrashing, maybe a final confession. But the men and women who have stood in those rooms will tell you the truth. It's usually quiet. It's clinical. The lights are bright. The air is cold. The language is procedural. The body follows a predictable pattern. The heart rate slows, the monitor steadies, and then the line goes flat. That night, it did not. The account I read described the moment the needle was pushed, the way the staff looked at the monitor and waited for the familiar decline. Instead, Caleb's heart rate climbed, not a little. It surged, as if his body had been jolted awake. His chest rose sharply. His hands flexed against the restraints. His jaw tightened. Then his whole frame began to shake in short, violent bursts, like a man trying to fight his way out of sleep. But he wasn't falling asleep. He wasn't going under the way the chemicals were supposed to make him go under. The lights in the chamber flickered. Not a full blackout, not enough to stop the procedure, but enough to make everyone look up and then look back down again, unsettled. And there was a smell, sharp, bitter, unmistakable, like electrical wire burning, like insulation melting somewhere close by. They stopped the procedure. They had to. The medical team called it a technical failure. They wrote the right phrases. They followed the steps that protect institutions when institutions don't want questions. They stabilized him, at least that's the word used. And they moved him back to the death row unit. But the moment that changed everything happened before they wheeled him away. Caleb turned his head, slow, as if he could feel every person in the room without seeing them. His lips cracked into a dry little smile, not relief, not triumph, something colder than both. And he rasped out a laugh that the report called hoarse and inappropriate, but the way it was described, this wasn't humor, it was recognition. He said, "I told you, you can't kill me, he wants to stay." That's the sentence that stuck. Not the failure, not the flickering lights, not the smell of burning. That sentence. He wants to stay. The staff didn't know what to do with that. They wrote it down like a symptom, like a final act of spite, like one more cruel line from a man about to die. But there was a priest assigned to that unit, a Catholic chaplain. I'll call him Father Aaron. And in the account, Father Aaron's reaction wasn't the kind you see in movies. He didn't shout. He didn't clutch a crucifix like a weapon. He didn't run into the room and demand the demon's name. He felt cold, a deep, crawling cold that didn't come from the air conditioning. And he understood something that many people don't understand until they've spent years listening to human suffering. The most dangerous evil is often not loud. It's patient. It's comfortable. It doesn't need to announce itself when everyone else is doing its work for it. In the days that followed, the official story was simple. Equipment issue, chemical delivery problem, personnel error, pick the phrase you like. The execution would be rescheduled. The state would correct the issue. Life would go on. That's how the system works. But death row doesn't go on. It sits there, sealed off from the rest of the world, like a corridor carved into concrete where time moves differently. The men inside count time in footsteps and keys and meal trays. The officers count time in shifts. The administrators count time in dates. And whatever else is there, whatever is fed on those dates, counts time in something far older. Caleb was housed in a cell, the paperwork identified by a letter and a number. I'll call it D-14, because that's how it appears in the notes. Father Aaron knew the unit's reputation. Everyone did. You don't need supernatural sensitivity to feel it. You just need to pay attention to patterns. There had been men in that same cell before Caleb, several of them, and their ends were complicated. One had smashed his head against the wall until he didn't wake up again. Another had died suddenly before his execution date, recorded as a medical event that required no further explanation. Another had deteriorated so badly in his mind that they had to restrain him just to move him. The note said the man became unmanageable. That's the language used when you want to describe terror without naming it. People whispered that something about that cell did it. The officers whispered too, not in the way civilians imagine, not wide-eyed, not sharing ghost stories over flashlights. They whispered the way grown men whisper when they've seen too much and they want to pretend they haven't. Father Aaron had learned long ago that rumor is not proof. Most of the time, rumor is fear looking for a shape. But he also knew that sometimes rumor is what leaks out when an institution refuses to speak. When Father Aaron visited Caleb after the failed execution, he expected rage. He expected panic. He expected denial, pleas, bargaining. Instead, he found a man who seemed stuck between emotions, like someone had wedged a piece of wood into the gears of his mind. Caleb admitted what he could. He'd been drunk that night in Houston. He'd fought. He remembered fists, shouting, heat in his blood. But the details, who swung first, who fell, where the knife came from, those details were fog. He wasn't a man screaming innocence to save his skin. He was a man who kept returning to the same point like a tongue worrying a sore tooth. There's someone here, he told Father Aaron, not a guy, not an inmate, something else. Father Aaron asked him what he meant, the way a priest asks, careful and steady, because you don't feed delusion, and you don't dismiss the possibility of the spiritual either. Caleb swallowed and stared at the wall as if listening to it. He likes it here, Caleb said. He doesn't want me to leave. If I die, he's stuck. So he holds on. Father Aaron asked, who holds on? Caleb's eyes shifted, and the account described it as a moment where his expression changed, not into a snarl, not into a possessed contortion, but into something that looked like contempt wearing a man's face. I don't say his name, Caleb whispered. Names have weight. That line is what made Father Aaron start taking notes. Because I've spoken to enough people in my life, people who are suffering, people who are lying, people who are mentally ill, people who are spiritually oppressed, to tell you this. The fear of a name is not a common detail. It's not a theatrical detail. It's an old detail. It shows up in places where people have encountered something they can't control, something that seems to respond when called. Father Aaron did what a responsible priest does. He didn't jump to conclusions. He prayed with Caleb in simple ways. Psalms, quiet petitions, words of peace, words of mercy, words that don't agitate the mind, that don't provoke, that don't turn the cell into a stage. And at first, it almost seemed like it helped, until the day he read a psalm that speaks about deliverance, about being freed from the snares of death, about being led out of a pit. The moment Father Aaron's voice reached that portion, Caleb grabbed the bars with such force that the skin on his knuckles tore, blood beaded, and ran down onto the concrete. His shoulders pulled against the restraints as if he wanted to drag the whole cell with him. And he said it again, through clenched teeth, like someone forcing words out against pressure. If I go, he stays. He can't stand that. Father Aaron felt the air change. Not dramatically, not like a gust, like a heaviness settling, the way you can feel a storm coming before the rain starts, the kind of weight that makes your thoughts slow down. He stopped reading and simply looked at Caleb, letting the silence sit. Caleb's breathing eased, but his eyes stayed wide, fixed on the upper corner of the cell, where the wall met the ceiling. Father Aaron followed his gaze. At first, he saw nothing. Then he noticed something that shouldn't have been there. faint scratches in the paint behind the bunk, the kind you might mistake for wear or vandalism. But Father Aaron had spent enough time in prisons to know the difference between random damage and deliberate marks. These scratches were deliberate. They formed letters, not all at once, not cleanly, as if someone had carved them over time, under stress, maybe with a piece of metal hidden in a shoe or a seam. Some letters were deep, some shallow, as if the hand that made them had weakened and strengthened in cycles. Father Aaron leaned closer. The letters were partially concealed under a thin layer of paint, like someone had tried to cover them without properly removing them. And there it was, a name, Zebrakiel. Father Aaron did not speak it aloud, not yet. He stepped back, and in the notes he later wrote, he described a sensation that many priests don't talk about publicly because it sounds too subjective, too easy to mock. He wrote that his stomach tightened the way it tightens when you step into a room and realize someone has been watching you for a long time. Caleb saw his face and gave a short, bitter laugh. "You see it," Caleb said. Father Aaron asked him softly, "Did you write that?" Caleb shook his head. "It was there before me." Father Aaron asked, "Who wrote it?" Caleb's eyes flicked to the door, to the slot where meals came through, to the hallway beyond. His voice lowered. "Men who didn't make it out," he said. "Men who died but didn't leave." That's when Father Aaron began to understand the shape of the problem. Because if this were only about one man's guilt or innocence, it would still be tragic, but it would be contained. If this were only about a malfunctioning injection, it would be a scandal and it would be repaired. But a name on a wall, repeated through different lives, in a cell with a pattern of psychological collapse that suggests something else. It suggests repetition, it suggests attachment, it suggests a presence that doesn't care who you are, only where you are. Father Aaron did what priests are trained to do when something is unclear. He sought records, he sought history, he asked older staff quietly, he asked retired chaplains if they'd heard anything. He requested old incident reports in the careful way you request something in a prison, never accusing, never implying you know more than you do, because the moment you do, doors close. And what he found, at least what was shared with him, was not a neat explanation. It was fragments. A handwritten note from a chaplain who had served in that unit years earlier. A single line in a file that shouldn't have been there at all. A warning that read less like theology and more like someone trying to leave a message for the next man who would walk those halls. The note said, in essence, "There is something on death row. It does not care about innocence or guilt. It feeds on legal death." Father Aaron read that and looked back at the name on the wall, Zebrakiel, and he realized something that chilled him more than any horror story. If there truly was a spirit attached to that corridor, if something had found a way to attach itself to sanction death, then the execution chamber wasn't simply a room. It was an altar, not one built for God. One built by human hands, fueled by human certainty, and kept alive by human indifference. And Caleb, sitting behind those bars, wasn't only a condemned man, he was bait. And the next time the state tried to finish what it had started, whatever had wanted to stay would be waiting either to hold him back again or to find a new place to cling to. That was the end of the first set of notes. And when I put the papers down, I remember thinking, asterisk, if this is true, then the most terrifying part is not the demon's name, asterisk. The most terrifying part is how many people will walk past that name day after day and call it nothing more than scratches in paint. I kept reading. And the longer I stayed with those pages, the more I realized the author wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't writing for an audience. He was writing the way a man writes when he's afraid his own memory will betray him later, when the mind starts to protect itself by blurring the edges. The next entries were dated in the same steady hand, but the tone shifted. Less observation, more urgency. The state, as you'd expect, moved quickly to regain control of the narrative. A failed execution is not just a human event, it's an administrative humiliation. It invites questions the system does not want asked. So they called it a mechanical issue. They blamed equipment and procedure, they promised correction, and then they scheduled another date. That's what institutions do. They don't repent, they adjust. Father Aaron's name appears often in these pages, not as a hero, not as a mystic, but as a man trying to be faithful inside a machine built for finality. He met resistance immediately. The warden of that unit, a man I'll call Royce Halpern, is described with a bluntness I found telling, not monstrous, not theatrical, just hard. A career man, a believer in fear as a tool. He ran the death row corridor like a closed fist. In the notes, Father Aaron wrote that Halpern treated the condemned as paperwork that could speak. His goal was compliance, not conversation. When Father Aaron requested time to conduct a deeper pastoral evaluation of Caleb after the failed execution, Halpern's response was what I'd expect from a man who believes he serves justice by efficiency. You do your prayers, he told Father Aaron. We do our job. Next time the line works, it's over. That phrase kept returning in different forms, over and over. The line works, it's over. Like death is a switch that can be tested, repaired, and flipped. Father Aaron tried another route. He began looking into Caleb's case, not because he was a defense attorney, but because he understood something simple. When there is injustice, the spiritual atmosphere changes. Bitterness is not just an emotion. It becomes a doorway. It becomes permission. Caleb's conviction was based on what the file called a clean chain, a knife, blood on clothing, witnesses. But when Father Aaron read the details, clean began to look like convenient. The witnesses were intoxicated. Statements shifted. Timelines didn't match. And the attorney appointed to Caleb, according to the notes, was overworked and underprepared, the kind of representation that meets the minimum requirement but not the moral one. The prosecution had built a story that fit the public appetite: bar fight, violent drifter, easy conclusion. And in that climate, the death penalty isn't a punishment, it's a performance. It promises closure to strangers who will never know the man's voice. Father Aaron wasn't naive. He knew Caleb wasn't a saint. He knew drunken violence is still violence. But he also knew that a system that treats uncertainty like an inconvenience will eventually kill the wrong person. And once that happens, the ground under that place changes. Around this time, another name enters the narrative, a young attorney I'll call Mia Rodriguez. Her first appearance is brief, almost incidental. A line in the margin, legal aid attorney requesting access. Mia's interest was triggered by the press coverage of the botched execution. She wasn't chasing ghosts. She was chasing procedure. She wanted to know why the state nearly killed a man and then acted as if the only tragedy was that it didn't happen fast enough. The notes say that when Mia first walked the death row corridor, she stopped just inside the threshold and drew a breath like she'd stepped into a refrigerated warehouse. She was sweating, though. That detail is repeated more than once. Cold air, warm skin, the body reacting in contradiction. She later told Father Aaron, according to his writing, that the hallway felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. Not scary, exactly. More like pressure, like standing too close to high voltage. Father Aaron didn't correct her, and he didn't encourage her. He simply listened. That in itself is a discipline. When you've done pastoral work long enough, you learn that fear loves to be fed, but you also learn that denial can be just as reckless. Mia met with Caleb through the thick glass and the metal grate that turned every conversation into a controlled exchange. She expected a man rehearsing innocence. Instead, she encountered someone tired in a deeper way than exhaustion. Caleb didn't beg, he didn't charm. He spoke like a man describing weather, something outside his control. He doesn't want me to leave, Caleb told her, looking past her shoulder, not into her eyes. If I die, he's stuck here. Mia wrote it off, at first, as prison stress. In the notes, Father Aaron admitted he hoped that's all it was. But then she asked the question that caught him off guard. Father, she said, who's Zebra Keel? Father Aaron's throat tightened when he read that line later, because he had never said the name to her, not once. Mia had seen it. She'd noticed the scratches behind the bunk when Caleb shifted and the light caught the wall at the right angle. She'd leaned forward, trying to make sense of the markings, and the name had emerged like a bruise under thin paint. Father Aaron asked her what she thought it was. She shrugged. A gang name, some kind of code, something inmates do to feel like they still exist. He didn't argue. He couldn't, not yet. Instead, he kept doing the only thing he was permitted to do without attracting administrative retaliation. He prayed with Caleb. Not a formal rite, not a spectacle. Simple prayers, psalms, words of mercy. The kind of prayer that calms the soul, if the soul is willing. But the pattern continued. Certain phrases provoked Caleb every time, and it wasn't random. When Father Aaron spoke about deliverance, Caleb's hands would tighten. When he spoke about forgiveness, Caleb's breathing would hitch as if something inside him hated the idea of release. When he spoke about truth coming into the light, Caleb would go still, eyes wide, as if listening to footsteps in a dark room. And then there were moments that the notes described with caution, moments Father Aaron seemed almost embarrassed to write down, as if the very act of recording them made him feel vulnerable. Lights would hum louder in the corridor when he approached Caleb's cell. The temperature would drop in a localized way, not the whole block, just that stretch of concrete, as if the air itself had become dense. Once, he wrote, the smell returned. Not always, not dramatically, just a faint thread of burnt insulation that made the back of his tongue taste bitter. Father Aaron did not tell the guards. He did not accuse the warden. He did not speak in the language of demons. He knew how quickly that would be turned against him. But the place noticed him. That is how I would put it. And the place began to react. One afternoon, Father Aaron attempted what he called an unstructured prayer of protection. That phrase matters. It means he was not performing the solemn rite of exorcism. He was praying within the boundaries allowed to him, asking God to protect a man and to break whatever attachment might be present. Caleb listened at first with his head bowed, shoulders tight. Then Father Aaron spoke a line about freedom from bondage, about not being held in a corridor of death, about God's authority over every dominion. Caleb's head snapped up. His eyes fixed on Father Aaron with an expression that did not match the man's face. Not rage, not fear, derision. And Caleb said, in a voice that sounded like his voice but sharper, he likes it when you all pretend you don't see. Father Aaron paused, heart beating hard, and asked quietly, who? Caleb swallowed, and the derision drained away like water leaving a sink. The man's shoulders sagged. His eyes darted to the corner of the cell, then back. I can't say it, he whispered. He wants silence. He wants everyone to keep doing their job. That sentence hit Father Aaron like a slap because it matched the posture of the entire institution. Keep doing your job. Don't look too closely. Don't ask inconvenient questions. Don't say names. In the notes, Father Aaron wrote something that I've seen in other cases, in other settings, far from prisons and executions. He wrote that the spiritual often clings to what is already present in the human. It doesn't always create new evil. It exploits existing habits. And in that corridor, the habit was sanctioned, death carried out without reflection. There is a moment in the narrative where everything sharpens. A guard named Glenn Parker enters. Glenn had been assigned to the block for some time. He wasn't new. He was described as competent, sarcastic, the kind of officer who kept order by projecting certainty. He didn't like chaplains. He didn't like attorneys. He didn't like anything that introduced complication. During one of Father Aaron's visits, a light above the corridor sputtered, popped, and shattered. The glass came down in a quick, violent sprinkle. One shard cut Glenn across the forehead. Blood ran into his eyebrow, into his eye. Glenn cursed, furious, and looked straight at Caleb like the inmate had thrown the glass himself. He slammed his baton against the bars and called Caleb a name that doesn't need repeating. Father Aaron stepped between them, not physically, but with his voice, telling Glenn to back away and get medical attention. Glenn did, but he didn't forget. From that day forward, Glenn developed a ritual. He would walk past Caleb's cell and strike the bars with his baton, hard, as if the sound itself kept something contained. The notes say he did it even when Caleb wasn't speaking, even when Caleb was asleep. That's how fear hides itself, as aggression. Father Aaron watched this with growing concern, not only because it was cruelty, but because cruelty is nourishment. In places like that, resentment spreads like mold. And if there truly was something feeding on bitterness, Glenn was offering it a steady meal. Mia, meanwhile, dug into the case. The notes describe her as persistent, sharp, unromantic. She filed requests, she called witnesses, she tracked down paperwork that had been buried in the administrative sediment, and she found something that should have changed everything. A witness statement that hadn't been presented properly, a detail about the victim having a separate conflict earlier that night, a suggestion, not proof, but a suggestion that Caleb may not have been the only one involved, possibly not even the man who delivered the fatal injury. When Mia brought this to the authorities, she was met with a kind of indifference that kills truth more effectively than lies. The prosecution's position was firm, the conviction stood, the sentence stood, the date would be reset. And the warden, Halpern, remained what he had always been, a man who did not believe in doubt. In his mind, doubt was weakness, doubt was disorder. Father Aaron requested a temporary halt to the process, not as a legal maneuver, but as a moral necessity. He argued that after a failed execution, after evidence questions, after clear psychological deterioration, there should be review. Halpern's answer was short. This is not your lane, Father. That phrase appears again, not your lane. And in the margins of that page, Father Aaron wrote a single sentence that I've never forgotten. Evil doesn't always need to tempt. Sometimes it only needs permission. Because while everyone argued about lanes, Caleb remained in that cell, staring at the corner, listening for something no one else could hear, and repeating the same warning like a man pointing at smoke while others argue about the color of the walls. He wants to stay, Caleb whispered one night, according to the notes, voice low enough that only Father Aaron heard. He doesn't care if I'm guilty. He just wants the door. Father Aaron asked, what door? Caleb's hands trembled. His eyes filled, not with tears, but with strain, like holding back a scream. The door you open, he said, every time. And then, as if the act of saying that much cost him, Caleb leaned back against the concrete and closed his eyes, breathing in shallow, quick pulls, like a man trying to keep himself from slipping under. Father Aaron left the block that night and went to the small office where chaplains store their books and vestments, and he wrote the last line of this section with a bluntness that makes me trust him more, not less. He wrote, I do not yet know what zebra keel is, but I know what this place is becoming. That is where the second set of notes ends. And it ends with a detail that may seem small until you understand how these things work. It says that as Father Aaron locked his office and stepped into the hallway, he heard a faint sound behind him coming from the direction of the death row corridor. Not a voice, not a scream, a laugh, hoarse, like a man who knows everyone will keep doing their job. The next thing Father Aaron did was what any priest with a conscience does when he realizes he may be standing in front of something larger than his own instincts. He went looking for oversight, not from the prison, from the church. Because when you're dealing with something that might be spiritual, you do not improvise, you do not chase drama, you do not turn a man's suffering into a test of your courage. You submit, you discern, you document, and you ask for guidance. That's what Father Aaron tried to do. And that is where the notes become even more unsettling. Because the deeper he pushed toward clarity, the more the environment pushed back quietly, indirectly, the way a thing pushes back when it doesn't want its feeding ground disturbed. He contacted the Chancery office connected to the region. He requested access to old chaplain reports, pastoral files, anything archived that mentioned irregular events on that unit. Officially, he framed it in careful language: pastoral concern, post-traumatic stress among staff, the need for additional support after an execution complication, That language opens doors that demon would slam shut. A week later, he received a thin folder, not thick, not dramatic, thin, which in itself told him something. Because prisons keep records like churches keep sacraments, everything gets written down somewhere. If the folder was thin, it didn't mean nothing had happened. It meant very little had been allowed to remain. Inside the folder were fragments, a few typed reports, a couple of memos, a handwritten note from a priest who had served as chaplain years earlier and had since died. The typed reports were sterile, clinical, empty. They described incidents without meaning. Inmate exhibited agitation. Inmate required restraint. Medical event occurred prior to scheduled procedure. No mention of the atmosphere, no mention of the staff's fear, no mention of those long nights when men on death row scream themselves hoarse, and the hallway seems to absorb it like concrete absorbs heat. But the handwritten note was different. It was a piece of lined paper, the kind you'd tear from a small notebook. The ink was faded. The handwriting was tight and slanted, written by someone who didn't expect privacy. Father Aaron copied it into his own notebook, word for word, and that is how it appears in the pages I read. It said that there was something attached to the death row corridor, not attached to a man's guilt, not attached to a particular inmate, but attached to the act itself, the legalized killing, the paperwork, the dates circled on a calendar, the body strapped down while strangers watched through glass. The note described it as a presence that did not tempt so much as it waited. And then it used a phrase that made Father Aaron stop breathing for a moment when he read it. It called it a keeper of the threshold, not a predator. A keeper, a thing that wants to remain at the doorway between life and death, because that doorway, in a place like Huntsville, is opened over and over and over again. In the margin next to that phrase, the old chaplain had written a name, the same name scratched under paint in Caleb's cell, Sebrakiel. Father Aaron did not bring that name back to Caleb right away. He understood the danger of suggestion. If Caleb was mentally deteriorating, naming the thing could shape the delusion. If Caleb was spiritually oppressed, naming the thing could provoke it. So instead, Father Aaron watched. He watched Caleb's patterns. He watched the staff. He watched the corridor. And the notes show him becoming increasingly aware that something was shifting not in spectacular ways, but in human ways. The way people's hearts tilt without them noticing. Warden Halpern became more rigid as the rescheduled date approached. He restricted movement. He shortened visits. He tightened rules. He spoke with an impatience that sounded like righteousness. The message was clear. The state had stumbled once, and it would not be embarrassed again. Mia, the young attorney, pushed harder and got punished for it in the quiet way. Institutions punish people. Calls went unanswered, requests were delayed, meetings were rescheduled at the last minute. People who had spoken to her once suddenly didn't recall details, but she was stubborn in the best sense of the word. She tracked down a bartender who had worked the night of the stabbing. She found an old police supplemental report that hadn't been emphasized in court. She located a man who had been sitting in the parking lot, high and half asleep, who remembered seeing the victim arguing with someone else, someone who wasn't Caleb, earlier that night. None of it was the kind of evidence that clears a man with one clean document. It was the kind of evidence that creates doubt. And in a system built to treat doubt as a threat, doubt is dangerous. Mia requested another visit with Caleb, and Father Aaron was present in the corridor, not inside the conversation, but near enough to observe. The notes describe Caleb's appearance then: thinner, eyes sunken, skin pale under the fluorescent lights. He wasn't the same man who'd laughed after the failed execution. That laughter had cost him. Whatever confidence had been in it had been replaced by fatigue. Mia spoke to him through glass and told him she was finding inconsistencies. She told him there were leads. She told him she was not giving up. Caleb listened, but he didn't brighten. He didn't celebrate. He stared at the lower corner of the window as if he couldn't bear to look too high. Finally, he said something that, to me, Sounds like the most honest line in the entire file. I'm not scared of dying, he told her. I'm scared of staying. Mia asked, staying where? Caleb's mouth tightened. His eyes flicked toward the corridor beyond the visiting booth, toward the strip of concrete that led back to the cells. Here, he said, in the hallway. He paused, then added, he keeps people in the hallway. Mia asked, who is he? Caleb's hands trembled as if even that question could be overheard. I don't say it, he whispered. Then, softer, almost like a confession to himself, he added, he hates it when somebody looks too close. Those words landed in Father Aaron's mind like stones, because Mia was looking too close, and Father Aaron was looking too close. And if the old chaplain's note was right, then whatever this thing was, if it was real, its food was not only the condemned man's fear, its food was the bitterness of everyone involved. The guards who learned to hate to survive, the prosecutors who learned to harden their hearts for career, the families who demanded death to soothe grief, the inmates who clung to rage, because rage feels like control. Bitterness is a river, and death row is a channel built to hold it. Not long after that visit, Father Aaron recorded a series of incidents that are small in isolation, but troubling in sequence. A guard, one not known for superstition, refused to walk past D-14 alone after shift change. An inmate 2 cells down began waking at the same time every night, screaming that someone was standing at the foot of his bunk. He never named a figure. He only said, it's waiting. Glenn Parker's behavior worsened. The notes pay attention to Glenn in a way that suggests Father Aaron sensed the guard spirit was becoming a battleground. Glenn started staying late on the unit without being asked. He started volunteering for extra rounds. He started acting like the corridor belonged to him, and he began saying things quietly at first that revealed what was growing inside him. He told a younger officer, you can't be soft here. This place needs fear. If they don't fear you, they don't listen. It was the same theme, repeated like a prayer to the wrong God. Fear keeps order. Fear makes obedience. Fear is necessary. Father Aaron heard Glenn say it one night, and when he did, he felt that same heaviness in the air, that subtle pressure like a storm building without clouds. He tried to speak to Glenn privately, not as an accuser, but as a pastor. Glenn stood in the corridor with the scar on his forehead, still pink, still healing, and his eyes looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. Father Aaron said, you seem weighed down. Glenn laughed once, short and bitter. You're the priest, he said. You tell me why. Father Aaron asked him if he'd been having nightmares. Glenn's jaw clenched. That was answer enough. In the notes, Father Aaron wrote that Glenn's nightmares began after the light shattered. He didn't describe them as dreams of violence or blood. He described them as dreams of being trapped, a hallway that never ends, a door that stays open but can't be reached, a presence behind him, close enough that he could feel breath, but never close enough to see. And always, always, the sense that something was satisfied with his fear. Glenn didn't tell Father Aaron that directly, not at first. It leaked out in fragments, in anger, in the way he started striking the bars harder when he passed Caleb's cell, like he could keep something contained by sound alone. And that's what I want you to notice here. The notes never describe the supernatural like a circus. They describe it like infection, like pressure, like influence. Father Aaron's prayers became more deliberate, still simple, still within his authority, but more focused. He began to pray not only for Caleb, but for everyone in that corridor, guards, staff, attorneys, even the warden. Because once a place becomes saturated with cruelty, everyone inside it starts to deform. And the old notes phrase kept echoing in his mind, keeper of the threshold. If that was true, then a failed execution was not merely an error, it was a tug of war. The system wanted the threshold crossed quickly, alive to dead, file closed, next case. But the keeper wanted the opposite, not life, not death, but suspension, lingering. The soul pressed against the doorway like a hand against glass. Father Aaron petitioned for permission to do more than casual prayer. He did not ask for a full solemn exorcism rite in the unit. That request would have been denied outright and might have cost him his position. Instead, he asked for permission to perform what he called a focused rite of deliverance, prayers for liberation, prayers of protection before the scheduled execution in a controlled setting. Warden Halpern resisted. But the notes suggest an outside factor changed the calculation. Public pressure, media attention. The state did not want another embarrassment. And in that climate, a quiet religious accommodation done off camera could be framed as pastoral care, not a sign that something was wrong. So they granted a narrow permission, not generous, not supportive, narrow, a short window, a small room adjacent to the execution area, limited personnel, no press, no spectacle. Father Aaron wrote that when he received the approval, he felt relief and then something else immediately behind the relief, dread, because he understood what the permission meant. It meant the date was locked. It meant the machine was moving again, and whatever had wanted to stay would be waiting at the threshold, not as an idea, but as a presence that had already tasted power once, when the chemicals failed and the condemned man laughed. Mia continued working up to the final days. She tried emergency filings. She tried to force review. She tried to widen the cracks she'd found in the case. But time is a weapon in death penalty cases. You can be right and still lose. The night before Caleb was moved into the holding area for the second execution attempt, Father Aaron visited him one last time in the cell. The notes describe the scene with a quiet clarity that makes it feel real to me even now. The hallway humming, the keys on the officer's belt clinking softly, the smell of disinfectant under everything, and beneath that, faint again, like a thread woven into the air, that burnt electrical smell. Father Aaron sat outside the bars. Caleb stood on the other side, close enough that Father Aaron could see the cracked skin around his knuckles. Caleb said, "They're doing it again." Father Aaron replied, "Yes." Caleb stared past him toward the corridor lights. "He's happy," he whispered. Father Aaron asked, "Why do you think that?" Caleb's throat worked like he was swallowing something that wouldn't go down. "Because everybody's doing what they always do," he said. "Nobody wants to know. Nobody wants to look." Then he leaned closer, voice shaking. "Father," he said, "if I die and I still don't leave, if I'm stuck in the hallway, don't let me be stuck." That was the first time in the notes Caleb sounded like a child. Not childish, just stripped down to a human plea. Father Aaron told him, "You are not alone." And Caleb flinched at that sentence as if something inside him hated hearing it. The next morning, they moved Caleb. They took him out of D-14, out of the corridor that had held him like a hook, and into the death house holding area where the final hours are spent under brighter lights and tighter control. Father Aaron wrote that as the cell door shut behind Caleb, the air in that section of the hallway felt momentarily lighter. And then, just as quickly, it turned heavy again, like whatever had been anchored, there wasn't leaving, only repositioning itself. Because the threshold wasn't in the cell. The threshold was in the room where the state finished its work. And that is where Father Aaron was about to stand. With a man in chains, a young attorney watching through glass, guards with fear behind their eyes, and a presence that had learned how to feed without ever showing its face. That's where the next pages begin.